The first thing Ethan Walker noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that comes after chaos, when the air still carries the heat of a battlefield and the sky glows faintly red through drifting smoke. His helmet visor was cracked, the display flickering weakly as he struggled to breathe. Somewhere nearby, a damaged engine hummed like a dying machine. Ethan lay half-buried beneath the twisted leg of a fallen combat mech, its metal frame pinning his lower body to the scorched ground. He tried to move. The armor in his legs answered with a dull grinding sound, and then refused completely. Great, he muttered to himself, his voice thin in the static of his helmet radio. Just great. The last transmission from his squad had gone silent nearly 20 minutes earlier. Rescue ships would come eventually. They always did. But on Varex, 9, eventually could mean hours. Ethan tilted his head slightly, staring up at the smoky sky. Through the haze he could see the faint outline of shattered orbital debris drifting slowly overhead like broken stars. The wind carried the scent of hot metal and dried dust across the battlefield. He focused on breathing. In, out, slow, steady. That was when the ground moved. At first he thought it was another damaged walker powering up somewhere in the distance. A heavy step, then another, each one slow, measured, too steady to be a machine. Ethan's visor struggled to sharpen the image through drifting smoke. A shape appeared between the broken hulls scattered across the plain. Tall, taller than any soldier he had ever seen. The figure moved with deliberate calm, stepping over debris that would have stopped a tank. As it drew closer, the smoke parted just enough for Ethan to see blue skin reflecting the dim crimson light of the sky. The alien stood nearly 9 feet tall. Broad shoulders, armor plated with unfamiliar symbols. A towering silhouette that could have stepped straight out of a nightmare briefing back on Earth. Ethan exhaled slowly. Well, he whispered to no one. Guess that answers the question of who won the battle. The alien warrior stopped a few yards away. For a moment, she simply looked down at him. Her eyes glowed faintly silver beneath the ridged frame of her helmet. Ethan waited for the inevitable. Capture. Interrogation. Something worse. Instead, the giant alien tilted her head slightly. As if studying something unusual, her gaze moved across the battlefield, then returned to him. She stepped closer. The ground trembled beneath her weight. Ethan tensed as much as his trapped body allowed. Look, he said weakly, forcing a tired grin. If you're here to finish the job, could you at least move the mech first? My legs are kind of busy right now. The alien knelt. Slowly, carefully. Up close, she was even larger, her presence blocking out the dim red sky above him. For a second Ethan braced himself. But instead of raising a weapon, the alien reached forward with massive hands and gripped the crushed frame of the mech. Metal groaned softly. Then the entire structure lifted just enough for Ethan's body to slide free. He stared up in disbelief. The alien lowered the wreckage aside as if it weighed nothing. Then she turned her attention back to him. Her glowing eyes softened. And before Ethan could even process what was happening, the 9-foot warrior leaned down and gently lifted him off the battlefield like someone rescuing a wounded child. For a moment Ethan Walker thought he had already died, and this was the strange calm that people talked about in stories. The battlefield noise faded behind them as the towering alien warrior carried him across the scarred plain. From his position in her arms the world looked different. Higher. Quieter. The wind brushed against his cracked visor, while distant smoke curled slowly into the dim sky. He expected the grip holding him to feel rough or careless. Instead it was steady and careful, like someone carrying something fragile. The alien moved with long measured strides that covered several feet at a time. Each step was deliberate, avoiding broken machines and scattered debris without even looking down. Ethan blinked slowly, trying to stay conscious. His body ached in ways he could not properly count, but something else confused him more than the pain. She had saved him. That thought did not fit with anything he had been taught. Back on Earth, every briefing described alien war forms as efficient and emotionless. Dangerous. Unpredictable. Certainly not gentle. Yet the giant warrior holding him had lifted a collapsed combat mech with one hand, and then carried him away from the battlefield without hesitation. Ethan cleared his throat weakly. His voice sounded small even to himself. You know, he said. Slowly. Most people would call this kidnapping. The alien did not answer at first. Her silver eyes remained forward, scanning the darkening horizon while the wind moved across the tall ridges of her armor. After several quiet seconds she spoke. Her voice was deep and calm, like distant thunder rolling across open land. You were trapped. Ethan let out a tired breath. Yes, that tends to happen when heavy machines fall on you. Another few seconds passed. Then she added quietly, you were still alive. The words hung in the air between them. Simple, matter of fact, as if that alone explained everything. Ethan frowned slightly behind his visor. Is that not normal after a battle? She asked. Ethan gave a weak laugh. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is not. The alien said nothing more. She continued walking until the shattered battlefield slowly faded behind them. The burning glow of damaged vehicles disappeared into the distance, while the land ahead turned rocky and quiet. Ethan realized she had chosen a path leading toward a line of dark stone hills rising nearly 100 feet above the plain. A narrow opening appeared between the rocks. A natural cave hidden from the open sky. The alien stepped inside, and the air instantly felt cooler. She lowered herself carefully to one knee and gently placed Ethan against the smooth stone wall. For the first time since she lifted him, her hands moved with purpose rather than travel. She examined the cracked plates of his armor, her large fingers tracing the damaged seams with surprising precision. Ethan watched silently, still trying to understand why this enormous warrior had brought him here instead of leaving him behind. The alien reached toward the side of his helmet and pressed a small release catch. The damaged visor lifted slightly, allowing fresh air to reach his face. Ethan inhaled slowly. It felt like the first real breath he had taken all day. The giant alien studied him for another quiet moment. Then she spoke again, her voice softer this time. Little soldier, she said gently, you are safe here. And somehow, against every expectation Ethan had ever learned about the galaxy, he believed her. The cave was quiet in a way Ethan Walker had never experienced before. Outside, the distant wind moved across the rocky hills, but inside the stone chamber the air felt still and cool. Ethan rested against the smooth wall where the giant alien had placed him. Without the constant noise of engines and alarms, the silence almost felt unreal. For the first time since the battle began, his heart started to slow. The towering warrior moved across the cave with calm, deliberate motions. Up close, Ethan could see details that the smoke and chaos of the battlefield had hidden. Her armor was layered with curved plates that reflected faint blue light from the mineral veins in the cave walls. Symbols etched along the edges glowed softly, like tiny stars. She removed one heavy piece of armor from her shoulder and set it carefully against the rock. The sound echoed gently through the chamber. Ethan watched her with cautious curiosity. Everything about her size suggested power, but the way she moved carried no threat. Only patience. The alien knelt beside him again, her silver eyes studying the damaged plates of his combat suit. She pressed one large finger against a cracked seam along his chest armor and paused, as if measuring the strength of the material. Then she looked directly into his eyes. Your shell is broken, she said calmly. Ethan exhaled a quiet laugh. That is military-grade equipment, just so you know. The alien tilted her head slightly. It is still broken. She was not wrong. With careful precision, she unlatched several locking clamps along the front of his armor. The damaged plates opened with a faint metallic click, releasing the pressure that had been pressing against Ethan's ribs. He drew a deeper breath and felt relief spread through his chest. The alien observed his reaction closely, as if confirming that the adjustment helped. Then she reached into a small compartment attached to her belt and removed a thin silver device no longer than 6 inches. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Please tell me that is medical equipment. The alien activated the device. A soft blue light flowed across its surface like water. She passed the light slowly over the worst sections of his armor and suit. The glow warmed the air slightly, and Ethan felt a strange tingling sensation where the beam touched the damaged material. Small fractures along the outer layers sealed quietly, the edges smoothing as if the metal remembered its original shape. Ethan stared in disbelief. Okay, he whispered. That is definitely better than our field kits. The alien deactivated the device and returned it to her belt. Then she rose to her full height again and moved toward the cave entrance. Ethan watched her silhouette framed against the fading red light outside. For several minutes she remained there, perfectly still, scanning the horizon like a silent guardian. The wind lifted strands of her dark hair across the edge of her armor. Ethan shifted slightly against the stone wall. "You know," he said slowly, "most soldiers would leave an enemy behind." The alien did not turn around. "You carried the smallest one," she replied. Ethan frowned in confusion. "What?" The alien finally glanced back at him, her glowing eyes steady and thoughtful. "On the battlefield," she said quietly. "Before you were trapped. You lifted the small one who could not walk." Ethan searched his memory through the haze of exhaustion. Then the image returned. A frightened alien child caught between the retreating lines. He had not even thought about it at the time. He had simply picked the child up and moved them away from the chaos. Ethan looked up at the towering warrior standing at the cave entrance. "You saw that?" The alien nodded once. Her voice softened as she spoke again. "That is why you are here." And suddenly Ethan realized that she had not taken him from the battlefield as a prisoner. She had taken him as someone worth saving. Morning arrived slowly across the rocky hills of Virex. 9, though the sky never truly turned blue. Pale gray light slipped through the cave entrance, stretching thin lines across the stone floor. Ethan Walker woke to the sound of quiet movement. For a moment, he did not remember where he was. Then the cool air of the cave and the faint glow of alien minerals along the walls brought everything back. The battlefield. The giant warrior. The strange safety of this hidden place. Ethan lifted his head slightly. His body still ached, but the pressure in his chest had eased and the armor repairs from the alien device had stabilized most of the suit systems. Near the entrance of the cave, the towering alien moved with the same calm precision he had noticed the night before. She had already removed several heavy sections of her armor and placed them neatly along the stone wall. Without the full armor plating, she still looked enormous, nearly 9 feet tall, her blue skin reflecting the pale cave light like polished stone. Ethan watched as she carried several smooth rocks toward the center of the cave and arranged them carefully in a small circle. Then she stepped outside for a moment and returned carrying something unfamiliar in one hand. It looked like a thick branch covered with dark leaves. She placed the branch between the stones and activated a small device from her belt. A faint spark of blue energy touched the leaves. Within seconds, a gentle flame appeared, casting warm orange light across the chamber. Ethan blinked in surprise. "You made a campfire," he said quietly. The alien glanced at him briefly before kneeling beside the small fire. "Your body temperature was dropping during the night," she replied calmly. "Heat helps your kind recover." Ethan shifted against the cave wall, studying the strange scene. A towering alien warrior building a fire to keep him warm was not something his training manuals had prepared him for. "You studied humans?" he asked. The alien shook her head slowly. "I observe." She reached toward a small pouch attached to her belt and removed several round objects that resembled dark fruit. With careful movements, she placed them on a flat stone near the fire where the warmth slowly softened their surface. A faint, sweet scent filled the cave. Ethan's stomach reacted immediately. He had not realized how hungry he was until that moment. The alien noticed the sound and glanced toward him again. Without a word, she picked up one of the warmed fruits and walked over to him. Standing beside Ethan, she crouched down slightly so that her massive frame did not loom over him as much. Then she held the fruit out toward him. "Food," she said simply. Ethan accepted it with both hands. Compared to her fingers, the fruit looked almost tiny, but it felt surprisingly heavy. He studied it for a second. "This will not turn me into an alien, right?" The warrior's expression remained calm, though there was the faintest hint of curiosity in her glowing eyes. "It will help you regain strength." Ethan nodded slowly and took a cautious bite. The flavor was sweet with a cool aftertaste that spread through his mouth like fresh water. He exhaled in relief. "Okay," he said quietly. "That is actually really good." The alien returned to the fire and placed another fruit on the stone to warm. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The cave filled with the soft crackle of burning leaves and the distant whisper of wind outside the entrance. Ethan watched the giant warrior sitting beside the small fire she had made for him. Her posture was relaxed but alert, as if she remained ready to move the moment danger appeared. After a while, Ethan spoke again. "Back on Earth," he said slowly, "we usually learn the name of someone who saves our life." The alien looked at the fire for a moment before answering. Her voice was calm, steady, and quiet. My name is Kelthera. Then she lifted her silver eyes toward him. And you, little soldier, what is your name? Ethan Walker rolled the unfamiliar fruit slowly in his hands while the small fire warmed the cave. The glow reflected across the curved stone walls and danced along the blue skin of the giant warrior sitting nearby. For several seconds, he studied her silently, still adjusting to the strange reality of the situation. A soldier from Earth sitting beside a 9-foot alien who had just saved his life. Somewhere back at command headquarters, someone would probably write an entire report about this moment. Ethan finally took another bite of the fruit before answering her question. Ethan, he said quietly. Ethan Walker. Kelthera repeated the name slowly, as if testing the shape of the sound. Ethan Walker. Her voice carried a careful precision, like someone memorizing something important. Ethan gave a faint smile. Yes, that is me. The alien nodded once and returned her attention to the fire. The warmth spread through the cave, softening the cold air that had settled during the night. Outside, the gray sky brightened slightly as distant clouds drifted across the rocky hills. Ethan leaned his head back against the stone wall and let out a slow breath. For the first time since the battle began, he felt something close to calm. You know, he said after a moment, back home people usually do not sit around campfires with someone they fought yesterday. Kelthera tilted her head slightly, considering his words. Yesterday you were not my enemy, she said. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Pretty sure both sides would disagree with that. The giant warrior looked toward the cave entrance where the wind moved quietly across the rocks. Your forces came to this world searching for control, she said calmly. My people came to protect those who live here. Ethan frowned slightly. War always sounded simpler in briefings. Two sides, clear reasons, clear orders. But standing in a quiet cave beside someone who had saved him, the explanation felt less certain. He glanced toward Kelthera again. Then why help me? He asked softly. If I was part of the group you were trying to stop. The alien was silent for a moment. Then she looked directly at him, her silver eyes steady and thoughtful. Because you carried the small one. Ethan sighed quietly, remembering the moment again. The frightened alien child clinging to his shoulder while he moved through the chaos of the battlefield. He had not stopped to think about sides or alliances. The child had simply needed help. Anyone would have done that, he said. Kelthera shook her head gently. No, she replied. Most soldiers step around the weak during battle. The words were not spoken with anger, only quiet observation. Ethan stared into the small fire while the leaves crackled softly. Maybe, he admitted after a moment. The cave fell silent again. Kelthera reached toward the fire and adjusted one of the stones so the flame burned more evenly. Then she stood and moved toward the entrance once more, scanning the distant hills with careful attention. Ethan watched her towering silhouette against the gray sky. Something about the way she stood there reminded him of a guard watching over a sleeping camp. Patient, protective. After several minutes he spoke again. So what happens now? Kelthera remained still as the wind moved across the entrance of the cave. Her voice came quietly a moment later. Now, she said, you recover your strength. Ethan looked down at the repaired plates of his armor, and then back at the giant alien who had chosen to help him for reasons that still felt impossible. Somewhere beyond the hills the war still waited. But inside the cave there was only warmth, silence, and the strange beginning of trust between two beings who were never supposed to understand each other. The gray daylight continued to stretch across the hills outside the cave, turning the distant rocks pale and quiet. Ethan Walker sat a little straighter against the stone wall, feeling strength slowly return to his arms and shoulders. The strange fruit had helped more than he expected. His breathing was steady now, and the dull pressure in his chest had faded into something manageable. Across the cave, Kelthera remained near the entrance, standing like a silent watchtower carved from blue stone. The wind brushed past her tall frame and carried faint sounds from the distant plains. Ethan studied her for a moment before speaking again. You have been standing there for a long time, he said. Do you ever take breaks? The giant alien glanced back at him briefly. I rest when it is safe, she replied. Ethan looked around the cave with a faint smile. Feels pretty safe in here. Kelthera stepped a little farther outside the entrance and scanned the horizon again before answering. Safety is something that changes quickly. Ethan could not argue with that. He shifted his legs carefully, testing the movement in his repaired armor. The metal joints responded with a quiet hum, and for the first time since the battle, he managed to straighten his posture without pain. That alone felt like a small victory. Kelthera noticed the movement and turned toward him again. Her glowing eyes moved slowly across his suit, observing the way he adjusted his weight. "Your body is recovering," she said. Ethan nodded once. "Thanks to you." The alien did not respond to the gratitude. Instead, she walked back into the cave and knelt beside the fire. The orange light reflected across the smooth plates of her armor that rested nearby. For a moment, she studied the small flame, as if considering something deeper than the warmth it provided. Then she spoke quietly. "My people have a role that begins when we are young." Ethan leaned forward slightly, curious. "What kind of role?" Kelthera lifted one of the stones around the fire and adjusted it so the flame burned evenly again. "We are called guardians," she said. "Those who protect life when it cannot protect itself." Ethan absorbed the words slowly. "Like soldiers?" he asked. Kelthera shook her head. "Not the same. Soldiers defend territory. Guardians defend the fragile." Ethan looked down at his hands, remembering the frightened alien child from the battlefield. "That explains the way you noticed what I did," he said quietly. Kelthera nodded once. "The small one could not run. You carried them even though it slowed your escape." Ethan shrugged lightly. "That is just basic decency where I come from." The giant alien studied him carefully for several seconds. "Then your world teaches wisdom," she replied. Ethan gave a quiet laugh. "You might be the first alien in history to say that about Earth." The fire crackled softly between them. Outside the cave, the wind continued to sweep across the distant rocks, carrying the quiet hum of the planet. After a moment, Ethan looked up again. "So you are a guardian," he said. "Does that mean there are others like you?" Kelthera's silver eyes drifted toward the horizon beyond the cave entrance. Her voice was calm, but something thoughtful rested beneath the words. "Yes," she said, "but today I stand alone." Ethan followed her gaze toward the empty hills. Somewhere beyond them, the larger conflict still existed, moving slowly across the planet. Yet inside the cave there remained only two survivors of opposite worlds, sharing a small fire and a fragile understanding that neither of them had expected to find. The afternoon light slowly faded across the hills of Virex 9, turning the gray sky into deeper shades of steel. Inside the cave, the small fire continued to burn with a quiet glow, its warmth reflecting along the stone walls. Ethan Walker stood carefully for the first time since Kelthera had brought him there. The repaired armor responded with a soft mechanical hum as he shifted his weight. His legs were stiff but stable. It felt strange to be upright again after lying helpless beneath a collapsed machine only hours earlier. He took a slow step forward, then another. Each movement felt stronger than the last. Across the cave, Kelthera watched silently, her tall frame still near the entrance where the wind carried distant echoes from the plains. "Looks like your medical technology works," Ethan said with a faint smile. The giant alien studied the way he moved before answering. "Your body is healing." The device only helped the process begin. Ethan stretched his shoulders slightly, testing the repaired sections of his suit. "Either way, I owe you one." Kelthera turned her gaze toward the horizon again. The open land beyond the cave stretched for miles, a quiet landscape of stone ridges and scattered shadows. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then something changed in her posture. It was subtle, a shift in the angle of her head, a tightening of her shoulders. Ethan noticed immediately. "What is it?" he asked. Kelthera stepped outside the cave entrance, her eyes scanning the distant sky with focused attention. The wind brushed past her armor as she remained perfectly still. Ethan followed her gaze, but saw nothing unusual at first. Only drifting clouds and the pale light of the fading day. Then he heard it. A distant sound carried across the air. Not loud, not close, but unmistakable. A low mechanical vibration echoing from somewhere far beyond the hills. Ethan's stomach tightened. "That sounds like engines," he said quietly. Kelthera nodded once. "Your people searched the battlefield." Ethan stepped closer to the entrance, squinting toward the horizon. "Probably rescue patrols," he said. "Or recovery teams." The giant alien remained silent for several seconds. Then she spoke in a calm voice that carried no fear, only quiet certainty. "They will not see it that way if they find me here." Ethan understood immediately. A 9-foot alien warrior standing beside a human soldier would raise more questions than either of them could answer. He rubbed the back of his neck and looked out across the hills again. Yeah, he admitted softly. You are probably right. The distant hum of engines grew slightly louder as time passed. Kelthera stepped back inside the cave and extinguished the small fire with a quick motion, covering the warm stones with loose sand from the cave floor. Within seconds, the orange glow disappeared, leaving only the cool gray light from the entrance. Ethan watched her movements. Efficient, quiet, prepared. You have done this before, he said. Kelthera looked at him for a moment. Guardians learn to disappear when necessary. The sound of distant engines continued to drift across the land. Ethan took a slow breath and looked at the towering alien who had carried him away from the battlefield and protected him through the night. For the first time, he realized that their strange moment of peace might soon come to an end. Kelthera turned toward the cave entrance again, her silver eyes reflecting the fading light outside. Ethan Walker, she said calmly, you must decide what happens next. And suddenly the quiet cave no longer felt like a place of rest, but the beginning of a choice that could change both of their worlds. The distant engine noise continued to grow across the gray sky of Virex 9, low and steady like thunder rolling across distant mountains. Ethan Walker stepped closer to the cave entrance and stared toward the horizon where faint shadows moved between the clouds. The rescue patrols were still miles away, but the sound carried clearly through the thin air. He felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle over his shoulders. Back on Earth, he had taken an oath. Protect the mission. Protect human lives. Report all alien contact. Yet nothing in that oath had prepared him for the towering guardian standing only a few feet behind him. Ethan turned slowly. Kelthera stood in the quiet cave with her armor resting along the wall beside her, her tall figure calm and steady as ever. The fading daylight painted silver reflections across her blue skin. She did not look like an enemy. She looked like someone who had simply chosen to help when help was needed. Ethan exhaled slowly. If those ships find you here, he said, they will not ask questions first. Kelthera nodded once. I understand. There was no anger in her voice. No fear. Only quiet acceptance. She stepped toward the cave entrance and looked out across the rocky hills once more. My presence near your forces would cause confusion, she said calmly. Confusion leads to conflict. Ethan leaned one shoulder against the stone wall and folded his arms. You could leave, he suggested. The hills go on for miles. They might never notice you. Kelthera considered that for a moment, but then shook her head. Guardians do not abandon those under their protection until they can stand on their own. Ethan gave a quiet laugh. I am standing. You are recovering, she corrected gently. The distant engine sound grew slightly louder. Ethan knew the patrols would soon begin scanning the terrain. Sensors would sweep the land for movement, heat signatures, and unusual activity. A hidden cave would not stay hidden forever. He looked back at Kelthera. You said your kind protects the fragile, he said. Does that include humans? The giant alien studied him thoughtfully. Life is fragile in many forms, she replied. Ethan rubbed his chin slowly while thinking through the situation. His helmet radio was still damaged. He had no way to contact the patrol directly even if he wanted to. But he knew how search teams operated. They followed signal traces from fallen soldiers. His armor would eventually lead them here. Ethan pushed himself away from the wall and walked toward the cave entrance. The wind brushed lightly across his face as he stepped beside Kelthera. For a moment the two of them stood side by side, watching the empty land where distant machines approached from beyond the horizon. Back on Earth, Ethan said quietly, we have a saying. Kelthera tilted her head slightly. What saying? Ethan looked up at her towering height and smiled faintly. You do not turn your back on someone who saved your life. Kelthera remained silent for a moment. Then she lowered her gaze toward him with calm curiosity. Ethan took a slow breath and continued. So if those patrol ships come looking for survivors, he said, they are going to find one. He paused briefly before adding the final part. And he is going to make sure they understand that you are not the enemy. The wind carried the distant hum of approaching engines across the hills, while Kelthera studied him with quiet surprise. For the first time since they had met, the ancient guardian seemed uncertain how to respond to a human choice. The sky above the hills of Virex 9 slowly darkened as the patrol ships finally appeared beyond the clouds. Their engines hummed through the air with a steady mechanical rhythm, the sound echoing across the stone valleys like distant thunder. Ethan Walker stood at the entrance of the cave with the cold wind brushing against his armor while he watched the approaching craft descend toward the battlefield miles away. Their lights blinked softly through the haze, scanning the ground for survivors. Behind him, Kelthera remained still, her tall silhouette framed by the quiet shadows of the cave. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Then the ancient guardian stepped forward until she stood beside him once more. "Your people will arrive soon," she said calmly. Ethan nodded slowly. "They always do." The ships moved closer, their scanning beams sweeping across the plains in wide arcs of pale light. Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before one of those beams crossed the hillside where the cave was hidden. He took a deep breath and turned toward the towering alien who had carried him out of the wreckage and watched over him through the silent night. "You should go," he said quietly. Kelthera tilted her head slightly. "You have already decided to speak for me." Ethan shrugged faintly. "I said I would try." The giant guardian studied him for a moment before looking back toward the approaching ships. "Your people may not understand," she said. "That is usually how first meetings go," Ethan replied with a small smile. The wind grew stronger as the nearest patrol craft moved overhead, its scanning beam drifting across the rocky ground below the cave entrance. Ethan lifted one hand slowly into the open air, letting the sensor light reflect off the metal surface of his armor. Within seconds the beam paused. Then it brightened. The patrol had found him. Ethan exhaled slowly while listening to the engines change pitch as the ship began adjusting its descent path. "Looks like my ride is here," he said quietly. Kelthera did not move. "What will you tell them?" Ethan looked out across the hills and thought about the strange path that had led him to this moment. A human soldier rescued by a being the galaxy would call an enemy. A guardian who had protected him simply because he was fragile. He smiled slightly as he answered, "I will tell them the truth." The patrol craft circled once above the hillside before lowering closer to the ground. Bright searchlights swept across the rocks until they finally illuminated the cave entrance where Ethan stood. For a brief moment the beam also touched the tall figure beside him. But Kelthera had already stepped back into the deeper shadows where the light could not fully reach. Ethan raised both hands to signal the patrol crew. The engine slowed. The craft began preparing to land nearby. Ethan took one last glance behind him. Kelthera stood quietly within the cave, her silver eyes reflecting the distant lights of the human ship. Neither of them needed to speak again. Some things had already been understood. Ethan turned back toward the landing craft and waited while the wind carried the sound of its engines across the stone hills. And somewhere behind him, hidden in the quiet shadows of the cave, the ancient guardian watched the human soldier she had chosen to protect. For the first time in many centuries, Kelthera realized something unexpected about the fragile species called humanity. Sometimes the smallest beings carried the strongest kind of courage. Not the courage to fight, but the courage to stand beside someone who once stood beside them. And far above the quiet hills, of Virex 9, the stars slowly appeared in the darkening sky, reflecting softly in the silver eyes of a guardian who had finally learned that mercy was not weakness. Sometimes it was simply what made a creature truly human.